Welcome back to the second instalment of our three-part special, Inside the Room, the Brexit Plot. And for those who heard the first episode, you will know we've reached the final few days before the 23rd of June, when the nation is going to vote on whether to leave the EU. We've covered Michael Gove's decision to back leave. He's here with us to help us explore what then happened as we got to polling day. We've already gone through the whole question of the economy and its role in the campaign, but we're going to turn now to those closing moments and the emphasis that was put on immigration.
Yes, look, this is draining and exhausting, and we're still not at polling day. We're about to go into the final days of the campaign as we approach the 23rd of June, which is, of course, as you know, Referendum Day.
Or Independence Day, as Boris Johnson called it.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong. Because these people are the same ones who've got consistently wrong.
This is proper Trump politics, isn't it?
No, it's actually a faith in the
Oxbridge Trump.
The Battle of the Thames, more naughty than nautical perhaps, an amazing armada, 30 or so fishing boats sailing up to Westminster, led by UKIP leader Nigel Farage. Brexit, they said, would save Britain's fishing industry. But Remain had been tipped off, outswept a counterforce, little boats and large, under Admiral Sir Bob Geldof, with this broadside.
Nigel, you're a fraud.
If it wasn't those people supervising Brexit, would you be a bit more relaxed about it?
Well, it is those people supervising it. That is what's on offer at the present time.
That's exactly the kind of message that might have muddied the water and mean that so many people aren't sure which side Labour's on.
If we vote leave and take back control, I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
This is about control and a policy of controlled immigration, but one of fairness, one that is much fairer and based on meritocracy as well.
These are the issues that are affecting people's lives. This is what people are going to vote on in the referendum, getting back control of our borders, easing the pressure on public services.
The Labour MP Jo Cox is in a critical condition after being shot near her constituency surgery.
We heard loads of screaming, and there was a woman laid on the floor behind a red car. Some other
Just before 1 o'clock today, Jo Cox MP for Batley and Spenborough was attacked in Market Street, Birstall. I am now very sad to have to report that she has died as a result of her injuries.
We should come to the kind of terrible, shocking murder of Jo Cox just 6 days before the poll in a moment. But before we do, that happened after what had been a pretty fraught couple of final weeks of the campaign, where my guess is that both of you had changed your view on what you thought by now the possible result of the referendum could be.
Yes, I certainly felt, as we were nearing the end of the campaign, that we were going to win. I remember the day, I think everyone does, that Jo Cox was killed, was murdered. Earlier that day, I had lunch with Dominic Raab, who was at that time a junior minister in the department that I was still just Secretary of State for. And Dominic, like me, was on the Leave campaign. And we were discussing what would require to be done in the days and weeks afterwards, from the point of view of making sure that we could put ourselves in the best position to negotiate the best deal. And we were having that conversation not as an idle fantasy, but from the point of view of two people who believed, whether or not we were still going to be in office as individuals, that we were going to vote to leave. And I think that was partly because the polling had narrowed, but also the intel that was being shared with us from the people on the ground who were campaigning for leave had suggested that we were outperforming expectations in communities that had been politically alienated in the past, and the expectation was that we were actually going to get a very good turnout from people who hadn't felt that it was worth voting before and who were going to vote Leave.
Yes, I mean, a critical mistake in the polling on the Remain side was the assumption, which is made in general elections, that people who've not voted before are not actually going to turn up on polling day. So you should not count them in polls. And they, to this day, are not really counted in opinion polls. And what happens in the referendum is that the Leave campaign reaches people who have never voted before and actually subsequently didn't vote again. I felt in the last 2 weeks we were losing. I felt this is all going completely wrong. And also I thought that, even if we scrape a narrow win, the wreckage in the Conservative Party is going to be kind of irreparable. And my own career basically is completely screwed at this point. What Leave has successfully done by this stage of the campaign is attach a rather narrow argument about sovereignty and parliament, whether we should be, whether the British courts should have supremacy over European courts or the other way around, which frankly, just as Michael was saying earlier in this podcast, only 15% of the population really were passionate about being in the EU at the time. Equally, only 15 to 20% of the population were really interested in issues of parliamentary sovereignty. But they've linked that issue to control of the borders. And, we could not answer this question. I remember doing so many interviews during that period. Whatever you say, Mr. Osborne, about your plans for managing immigration in the future, it is true, isn't it, that if you're in the EU, you can't stop someone from the EU coming to Britain. And that was the unanswerable question that we'd been looking for on the other side to throw at Leave, but Leave had found against us. And it was, I felt in the last couple of weeks, and you hear, in that medley of clips, you had Priti Patel and Nigel Farage and, the armada of boats up the Thames. They're really ramming home. The whole campaign switches to immigration in the last couple of weeks.
That's right. And
you actually, Ed, it's interesting, Ed, you weren't in Parliament at this point because, you'd lost your seat a year earlier. But, you call me and we'd done some campaign visits together on the economic issues, but you call me and you say, you've got to do something about immigration. And you actually write an article, don't you, in the Daily Mail about it as well. And your sort of political antennae were telling us, we've got to lean into this issue. And it's interesting. I'll ask you this view, because often in politics you would say, okay, even if an issue is important, if you're not winning on it, don't talk about it. Reduce the salience of the issue, to use the kind of technical political term. But you're arguing at the time, that's hopeless. You've got to talk about it and you've got to lean into it.
As you say, I was on the outside, really having conversations with nobody. I didn't know that at the same time, in these weeks, Peter Mandelson and Will Straw had both written memos into the campaign saying that the immigration argument is being lost, that this is a real problem, especially in Labour areas, and you've got to do something akin to the vow in the final days of the Scottish referendum, where David Cameron and other leaders vowed to deliver more change and more reform. And it just felt to me as though that by trying to fight the status quo argument, we were just sort of drifting to defeat. And I know the argument because I'm sure that you and David and Andrew Cooper, the pollster, would have been talking about this, that because it's not a good argument for us, let's not talk about it. And the counter-argument that I believed, and this is really from the seat I had fought up in Morley and when we'd won in 2010, is that if you don't talk about the thing people are worrying about, it's much harder to get them to listen to the thing that you want them to worry about. You have to have permission to put your arguments to them, and that people were closing their ears on the economic fear argument because the Remain campaign weren't talking about what they were worrying about. So my article in the Daily Mirror basically said that we should vote to Remain, but it's not a vote for the status quo. It's a vote for more reform. And I went back to the David Cameron renegotiation and said he's right to say that we need more control on economic migration. That's the right argument for Europe and for Britain, and that we should be making that argument. And I was, trounced by the the insiders on the Remain campaign, I now find out nobody really told me that I was very unpopular for making this argument. But I thought that was what was needed, and I remember ringing you and urging you, and I thought you were open-minded to the need to do something.
You were ahead of your time, Ed, because Michel Barnier, when he launched his bid for the French presidency, argued that France should be able to opt out from EU freedom of movement. Now, of course, he was the guy who was negotiating on behalf of the EU during Brexit. But I'd say two things, and there are many criticisms of the Leave campaign, and we might want to get into them. But the two things I'd say are, one, the decision to leave coincided with Britain already actually probably the country in Europe most relaxed about migration, becoming more relaxed about migration. Its salience as a topic diminished. The welcome that the British public would give to people coming here in opinion polls and in other sentiments went up. And also, it became a more difficult issue for European countries as well. And again, it's one of the, and I can understand why, underappreciated consequences of Brexit, that you had an area that had been a focus of real political tension dropping down the list of issues about which the public were worried.
Well, I've tried hard during this podcast not to disagree with you, Michael, but I would say, the country stored up trouble for itself because people were promised in 2016 that immigration would fall. It didn't fall, and here we are in 2024, and immigration is back as a huge issue because people feel essentially they didn't get what they voted for 8 years ago. And essentially the sort of liberal Brexiteers who made the argument you make, which is it's not about the numbers, it's just about whether we have a say on it, are being a bit naive. It was also a numbers game, and, Farage stirred that up with things like that poster of thousands of people queuing up to get into Britain.
Which you said made you shudder.
It did.
And I would say the Leave campaign kind of just ran with it. And I would it brings me on to this point, which is at this point in the campaign, and it comes back to something you said earlier about, you hadn't really wanted to be part of it, but once you're part of it, you need to win. At this point, Leave is doing whatever it takes to win. And there are quite ad hominem attacks at this point on David Cameron from members of his own cabinet, not you particularly that I remember, but people like Priti Patel are going around saying, he's all right for these rich Remainers, i.e. David Cameron, who's, by the way, tax affairs had just been exposed in a ill-timed BBC expose on the Panama Papers. And at this point, there's these ad hominem attacks on David, on me, and so on. And, we are having this conversation in number 10, and David records this in his memo. So I'm saying, even though you're a friend of mine, Michael, I'm saying we have got to hit back at Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and these people. They're attacking us personally. We've got to take them down. We've got to crack their credibility.
But you didn't.
So the reason we didn't was David throughout, and me, and I'm certainly not blaming him, was like, I've got to try and lead this party after the referendum. So he had two things in his mind, which is I've got to win on the 23rd of June and I've got to govern on the 24th of June. And so we were not kind of burning the house down to win. And I wonder whether you think, Michael, we should have taken the gloves off and really gone for it. Because David, I think if you read his chapter on this in his memoirs, I think kind of regrets holding back in some of these arguments.
Before you answer, Michael, there was one zinging moment in the debates, which actually was stark because it was so unusual, which is Amber Rudd saying this about Boris Johnson.
And from Boris, well, he's the life and soul of the party, but he's not the man you want driving you home at the end of the evening.
It was very powerful, had loads of publicity, but it was like the first Remain on Leave blue attack, and probably the only one. And is George right that there wasn't enough of that from the Remain campaign?
I think it was certainly the case that David refrained from and tried to prevent others from indulging in any sort of personal attack. But I think it would only have ended up making the situation for the Remain campaign worse. If you're way ahead and you've got your opponents on the run and you want to bury them, as it were, then you can do it. But if you're on the ropes, it risks looking desperate by turning it into something about personalities. And the other thing also is that it risks fueling the sense of this being a Tory psychodrama rather than a big question about the future of the nation.
And how about the Gove psychodrama? I mean, how are you feeling? It's a week to go.
Yeah.
And potentially you're going to win. You now think you're going to win. I mean, is it good or is it catastrophe? I mean, are you about to wreck your party, wreck your relationship with George and David? What the hell's going to happen? Boris Johnson is potentially going to be the Prime Minister. My God. How are you feeling?
I felt during the course of the campaign, obviously the day of Jo Cox's murder was terrible for 1,000,001 reasons. It was, one of those days when everything stops, and your mind is filled with a sense of just loss and disaster. But prior to that, I was actually energized. There were moments in the campaign which I felt I'm making arguments in which I believe, and those arguments seem to be finding an answer. As I say, though, not every aspect of the campaign was I entirely comfortable with. But again, whenever I expressed concern, the rest of the team would say, look, we have a responsibility to stick together, to hang together.
But back in February, you are agonised.
Yes.
But you think you're going to lose.
Yes.
And now you think you're going to win. Aren't you more agonised?
Well, I think, curiously, during the course of the campaign, it's not that I've become radicalised. My view broadly was the same throughout. But I've actually become more convinced that leaving is right. Now, it might be the case that a psychoanalyst would say in the course of a campaign, confirmation bias occurs. But I'd like to think it was because the more I saw the arguments tested, the more I believed that the position was the right one to pursue.
What do you think?
Well, I think you get caught up in these things, and in politics. I think one of the politics is a drug. It's often compared to a drug, isn't it? And one of the reasons why is it's all absorbing, it's all consuming, and all of us. I mean, it's probably extraordinary. We're all sitting around the same table. In different ways, we've all been opponents, and it's a 24-hour business. You wake up thinking about it, you go to bed thinking about it. But it can also be incredibly damaging, and you don't really see the damage it's doing around you while you're in it. And I think that's what happens in these campaigns. Michael is winning, and that's an exhilarating feeling. But he's also doing enormous damage, not just him personally, but the Leave campaign, or at least on the Conservative Party, is basically kind of destroying the Conservative coalition at this point.
At a week out,
and sort of shredding the credibility of all the people that they're sitting around the cabinet table with. And at this point, I am very pessimistic.
Are you trying to persuade David Cameron to say something about immigration or not?
The real conversation we had, which was completely secret, was, do we go to Angela Merkel and plead, basically, for a final concession, something we can produce in the last week of the campaign, where the EU says, okay, you now can, suspend free movement of people. And we debated it in a very small circle, myself, David, Ed Llewellyn, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff at the time, now an ambassador to Italy. And we, in the end, concluded we shouldn't do it for two reasons. One is the very act of asking might leak, and that would be catastrophic. And, not just leak from our side, but from the German side. And second, we probably wouldn't get it. And there was a sort of half-hearted conversation that David Cameron had with the Dutch Prime Minister and with Angela Merkel, but he didn't kind of specifically ask for anything. And Angela Merkel goes, well, David, you shouldn't appease these people. And those who've run with the immigration argument in Germany haven't done very well. And when I look back on the whole campaign, I think there are two things. If you want to know, could the result have been different? There are two things that I think would have made the difference. The first is if Boris Johnson had stuck with Remain. Not Michael, because I don't think Michael was ever persuadable. But I think if Boris Johnson had been with us, Boris made a huge impact on the campaign, as you've heard just from these clips. He's the one that's got the the voice in all the clips we've heard on this podcast. And second, if Angela Merkel had, or the EU had given us something that would have enabled us to answer that question, which we couldn't answer, which is, while you're in the EU, you can't control the number of people coming into this country.
Of course, it was possible that the terrible murder of Jo Cox was going to be also one of those moments. I think over that weekend, people wondered. I mean, she was a next-door candidate to me. So when I lost in 2015, she won. And it was a terrible day. But actually, people don't always see, I think, into the window of the lives we lead. I mean, for us, this was me being called by a vet to tell me what happened to Jo before it was public, and us knowing that this could have been a vet. I mean, she was 10 miles down the road in a very similar kind of seat, facing very similar pressures. And then we had to have the conversation about how do we call our 3 teenage kids so that they knew first and that they weren't destabilised, because we knew from past times when this has occurred how terrible it was for them. And that was happening for members of Parliament, Remain and Leave, right across the country. It was a terrible moment. Campaigning was suspended. And I think there was a feeling that this actually may also change the result.
Yes, I think there was that feeling. And I remember it was certainly the case. I talked on the telephone that evening to Boris and to Gisela. And we were all in different ways, exactly as you describe, in a sense of loss, grief, disorientation, and
partly thinking, was it our fault?
No. It was certainly thinking that it would, because she was such an admirable person, and because she had been campaigning for Remain, that people would feel an understandable sense of sympathy for her friends, her family, and the cause. So, but it wasn't so much we were worried about anything other than the fact that a politician had died in the most horrific circumstances. And as you know, subsequently, there are...
well, someone tried to kill you, didn't
exactly.
they, Michael?
The shadows
several years later.
Later, the shadows crossed my life. So, there was that emotion about it. But I remember the next day, one of the campaign team who was involved in polling saying, and focus group work, saying, people won't connect this with the referendum. And I said, well, of course, this poor woman was killed campaigning for Remain. And it's obvious that the person concerned is some sort of far-right nutter and so on. So, it's clearly a political event. And the person involved in polling said, most people will look at this tragedy and say, a lovely person has been killed by a nutter. This is horrific, but it's got nothing to do with these decisions that affect my life. And to this day, I don't know whether or not that analysis was correct, but I think that it may well have been.
There is an argument that what it did was sort of freeze in aspic the campaign, because the campaigns were suspended. The Labour Party basically then stopped campaigning between then and polling day. And I remember calling up Tom Watson several days after Jo had been murdered, pleading with him, he was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, to get the Labour Party back campaigning for Remain. But he said, we're still in mourning, we're still suspending our campaign. And what it also didn't give Remain was that kind of last week, which had happened in the Scottish referendum, it had happened in various referendums elsewhere in the world, like in Canada, where suddenly everyone goes, oh my gosh, Leave is going to win. And then you focus on the consequences of leaving the EU and suddenly Leave has to defend its position rather than Remain. And I think because there was such a sort of strange feeling after her terrible murder, and because campaigning was suspended, it never really got going again. You didn't have those sort of eve of poll, opinion poll surveys that focused attention on the result. Definitely. And so we end up, and we should probably turn to it now, on the night of the 23rd, when the nation has voted in the Brexit referendum.
Before we do, can I just ask Michael one other question, which we can slip back in? I mean, The Farage poster, which you said made you shudder,
Yes.
came out on the day of her murder and was then around in the days subsequently. And you were kind of appalled by that. The Leave campaign had not wanted to be associated with Farage. How much angst and worry was there internally about what damage the combination of these events and the hardening of the Farage bank's message on immigration could do?
There was there was a spectrum of opinion in that those of us who were politicians, members of the House of Commons, felt the whole thing more emotionally, whereas as I alluded to earlier, the guys who were involved in the polling and so on, who weren't part of the sort of the emotional family that is the House of Commons, looked at it in a more clinical way. Again, maybe we wouldn't have had a referendum in the first place if it hadn't been for Farage's campaigning between 2010 and 2015 and all the rest of it. But the one thing that I do know is that if it had been left to Nigel to campaign, then Leave would have lost, because he was just not capable. He has formidable gifts and certain, drawbacks, but he would not have been capable of commanding a majority.
Good evening and welcome at the end of this momentous day when each one of us has had the chance to say what kind of country we want to live in. At 10 o'clock, the polling stations close after weeks, months, years of argument.
And no, I'm not conceding, but my sense of this is that the government's registration scheme, getting 2 million voters on, the 48-hour extension, may be what tips the balance.
We are confident and hopeful that there will be a victory for the Remain campaign, but we'll obviously have to see. And I think
so. There is the first result from England and from within Great Britain that we've had, and that is 49.3% for Leave, 50.7% for Remain, and that could be a very significant result.
If 10 Downing Street was feeling a degree of relief at 10 o'clock this evening when they heard the YouGov poll, maybe the champagne's gone back in the fridge.
We've got a result from Sunderland.
The total number of votes cast in favour of Remain was 51,930. The total number of votes cast in favour of Leave was 82,000.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
I'm going to start with you, Michael. Tell me about that evening, and then I'll tell you about mine.
Earlier that day, I'd had lunch with someone who I think is a friend of all of ours, called Nicholas Bowles, who was a Conservative MP, very strongly on the Remain side, and who's been a friend of mine for many years. And I said, you've won. I said the polls show that it will be 55-45 for Remain, and I think that's right. Later that evening, some friends had come round for dinner, some of whom were nothing really to do with politics, to have a glass of wine and to watch the results later. I couldn't bear to watch the results. I thought we're going to lose and it's going to be difficult, and also I felt shattered at the end of the campaign. So I slipped off to bed early, just before 11 o'clock. And I was then woken up the next morning. My wife Sarah woke me up because my phone was ringing, and I answered the phone, and it was a wonderful guy called Henry Cook, who worked as my special advisor. And Henry has a sort of fluting treble voice. And on it he said, "Michael, we've won." And that was it. I said, well, I suppose I better get dressed then.
People have this idea that you'd have been out all day getting the vote out, and then up all night in the campaign headquarters. You went out for lunch.
Yes.
Then you had dinner. Then you went to bed. I don't know
Yes.
whether you went to bed and you were tired because you'd had a long lunch and then
It wasn't
dinner.
that long a lunch.
I also went to bed. For me, this was quite triggering because a year before I'd lost my seat, and I thought I'm not going to have to sit up another night to see a result unfold. So I went to bed about 11 while Yvette went down to do an interview with Robert Preston on the green. I was woken up by her banging the door, coming in about 1:30 in the morning. Woke up, looked at my phone, assuming that Remain would just win, and it was clear by that point Newcastle Sunderland. It was all going the other way. So I got up and watched a television grip for 2 hours, watching this all unfold. You were asleep the whole time.
Yes.
What was going on? It makes me feel like, were you just completely in denial?
No, I was shattered. That was the thing. But the other thing also
But what about nervous energy and adrenaline? You were about to kind of do the most exciting thing, win a great campaign. You were asleep.
Well, at the time, I thought that we had lost. But the other thing also is, if we, whatever the consequences, I'm going to be in a stronger position to deal with them if I've managed to have a few hours shut-eye. The final day of campaigning had been the day beforehand. I remember we'd been in the West Country and came back on that fabled bus. And on the day itself, there wasn't much more that I could do. Doesn't
it surprise you a bit, George?
Well, I definitely wasn't asleep. Let's be clear about that. So I was in Downing Street. I was in the Thatcher room, which is on the first floor of Downing Street.
The reports say that you brooded in the corner.
I wasn't particularly brooding. There was a big kind of round table, which I think had come from a kind of G7 summit.
G8, I think.
Well, back then it was the G8. And yes, we were sort of sitting there. There was me, David Cameron, and basically David Cameron's kind of core Downing Street team, his closest friends and advisors. And we were watching the television like everyone else. And I had a really bad feeling. I had been thinking for several weeks this is going badly wrong, but it was clearly going to be close, so you just sort of never know whether you're just going to nick it or not.
And you talked with David Cameron about what you would do if
we had already
before.
So David and I had gone to stay with David in his house in Oxfordshire a couple of days earlier, for the Friday before polling almost a week. And we'd discussed what would happen if we lost, and we'd basically decided then and there that he was going to resign as Prime Minister the next morning. But we didn't want to say that or even hint at it. Indeed, he was being asked that question a lot in interviews, but we didn't want the referendum to be about his premiership. So he was basically not telling the truth. He was saying, of course, it's not about me. I'm not going to resign. But
and you agreed with that decision?
Yes, I did. And we will come on and perhaps talk about it because he resigns the next morning. We certainly debated it. So on the night, we're watching the results. There's a Remain party just off Trafalgar Square, and no one from our side really wants to go to the Remain party because we just want to watch the results. But in the end, I think, well, I better go. So I pop out for an hour, go and see the various business people who'd supported Remain, the donors, all of whom, put their money where their beliefs were. They were still pretty upbeat because they saw the YouGov poll. I came back.
The pound had shot up in the hour after the polls closing at 10.
Farage had conceded defeat. Whether, of course, he was actually speculating on the pound is
it's speculated that people made quite a lot of money out of that.
Yes.
That particular kind of gyration of the pound. I'm not saying Nigel Farage did, but it's certainly the case. The pound went up and then down, and people made a lot of money.
Yes, yes, although people also lost a lot of money. Anyway.
Were you ever a financial currency trader?
No.
No, George, were you? No, because I wasn't either. Just wondering,
who was?
Who was?
Oh, yes.
Right.
Anyway, well, that's a reference to Nigel Farage, who doesn't get our in-joke. The results start coming in, as we've just heard, and it's a bit like a kind of slow car crash in that room in Downing Street. It gets grimmer and grimmer.
We have sat before in the ITV studios watching it unfold, but it's much more painful to be on the inside.
And it's not, it's not like a general election. Of course, we've had this similar experience in the Scottish referendum. I felt a real sort of pit in my stomach watching the Scottish referendum in Downing Street a couple of years earlier. But then, the exit poll had been confirmed by the results. But unlike a general election, which is sort of built up seat by seat, here you have a sort of rising tally of votes. And, there was all this question of when the cities were going to declare and were they more pro-Remain. Anyway, it was basically clear by around midnight, I think, that we were losing.
But your pollster, Andrew Cooper, told you were going to win at 10 o'clock.
And that we were 10 points ahead.
What was going on?
Well, the polling... Well, it comes back to something we talked about earlier. What the polling had not taken account of, certainly on the Remain side, was that people who had never voted before in a general election were going to come out and vote in this referendum.
Big numbers.
And British politics has not really heard from them since, sadly, because they haven't voted in subsequent general elections. But on that day, they came out and voted, and they'd been discounted in the polling, and obviously that was a huge mistake. And also, by the way, if the polling had been accurate, I think it would have forced a conversation before referendum day on the real consequences for Britain of leaving the EU, which we've lived with for the last 8 years, whether you like the result or not. There have clearly many more things have been aired after the event than were aired before it. So things going to get worse and worse. And in the early hours of the morning, we go down to David Cameron's office, his small office on the ground floor of Downing Street.
Who's there?
So there's me, there's Ed Llewellyn, his chief of staff, there's Kate Fall, his deputy chief of staff, there's David, and there's Andrew Feldman. And that's it. So there's just 5 of us, and that's the kind of core Cameron team. And, we don't really have much to say. It's like people, I guess, were emerging from a kind of bombed building or a sort of, we're in shock. And the only kind of confirmation, David wanted was that he should resign the next morning. And we all agreed that we'd stick with that plan. And then we all went back I went back to my flat, which was at the top of 10 Downing Street. I didn't wake anyone up. I just went, and there was a sitting room there. I lay on the sofa, wide awake, and I just thought, not only did I think, as I still do, this is a disaster for my country. I just knew it was an absolute disaster for my career. It was basically the end of my political career. And, one of the things I would, I think I'm quite good at in politics is sort of seeing how things are going to play out, having an intuition for how things are going to play out, even if sometimes as a result I've been on the losing end of things, as it was in this case. And I could just see this is the end of my career. And I'm literally lying on a sofa in 10 Downing Street. So I'm at the very pinnacle of that career.
And the guy who shafted you is fast asleep.
Yes, but maybe that would have been better.
Not by that point.
So I don't think I got any sleep that night. It's definitely, of my political career, of any part of my career, the most traumatic day of my life.
It's really interesting because when I listened to the two of you, I mean, Michael thought he was going to win in the days before, and George thought he was going to lose in the days before. But I think out there in the country, I think most people thought that Remain would just win.
Yes.
Which is what the poll said on the eve. It's what I thought when I went to sleep at 10:30. And actually, if you look at the coverage that night, I mean, normally in politics, from the exit poll what the result's going to be, but there was a sort of dawning. And in David Dimbleby, the kind of great broadcaster, you can hear the sort of wobble in his voice. He's genuinely shocked. He's not quite expecting this.
No.
He's actually announcing Britain is leaving the European Union. And I think over that night, I mean, it genuinely was, for the vast majority of people, quite a big surprise.
And I think for people within the broad political village, and I'm not trying to make a sort of an elites versus others point, but just within the broad political village, the overwhelming view would have been either support for or at the very, very least acquiescence in, on the balance of advantage, our membership of the European Union. I remember afterwards talking to someone who's a friend, Richard Harrington, who was a Conservative MP and Minister, who said, Michael, I do not know a single person in the civil service, amongst my friendship group, or in business who voted to leave. And he was saying so in a slightly apologetic way, as though he didn't know the country which he was serving.
But these were all your friends.
Well,
and what had you done?
Well, within the Conservative Party, we found that actually the parliamentary party split almost down the middle for Leave and Remain. So whatever side I'd gone on, I would have found.
Yeah, but hold on, your natural home and your friends were mainly in the Remain side of that half. Weren't they?
Well, that was part of the
You had some new friends in the Leave side.
This is why you went to sleep.
Well, I think.
Did you ring Boris at 4:30 to say we've won?
No, I spoke to Boris afterwards. However,
where was he?
When he came into the office. But one thing
was Boris in the Leave party overnight?
No.
That wasn't a very forthcoming answer.
No. Because the point I was going to...
Boris was in a bedroom. We're just not sure which one.
No, Boris was okay. But earlier that week, Boris had to go to the
somebody graduation. Said, don't drive the car home.
To the graduation of his daughter from St Andrews University. But the point I was going to make is that I had, yes, George is right. Most of my friends in the Parliamentary Conservative Party were on the Remain side. Not all. Some of my closest friends were on the Leave side. But outside Parliament, there were people who I had long believed in, long trusted, who knew my mind, as it were.
Of course.
And many of them were Leave. So a friend of mine, Paul Marshall, who ran ARC schools, funnily enough, Michael Portillo, about whom I'd written a book a gazillion years ago. In the run-up to the referendum, I had a cup of tea or a drink with every single one of them and ran through my thinking. And what struck me is that there were one or two exceptions to this, but most of the people outside politics who knew me and either, generally agreed with my political outlook or had some sympathy for some of the things I was trying to do, all tended to be on the Leave side of the argument, including friends of mine who were journalists like Dominic Lawson and Charles Moore and so on. And again, this goes to one of the points that George made earlier. For the country, it was a momentous decision. But for the Conservative family, it was divisive in a way that it just wasn't for other parties.
So what you're saying is that you weren't really a Cameroon.
I think that, one of the ironies is that one of the people who had more to do with making David Cameron leader than anyone apart from George, Steve Hilton, was on the Leave side as well. So I think that...
So even the Cameroons were split.
I mean,
Yes.
the problem was, and we should move on to the kind of fallout of the vote, is that the whole, but you can't help when you tell the story to get into the personalities, to get into the psychodrama. But I was highly critical of the BBC and other sort of neutral media organisations.
Who cares how Steve Hilton votes?
Yes, but they were running Steve Hilton as the headline on the news just 2 or 3 days before this momentous decision, and whatever happened to all of us afterwards, Britain was going to live with this decision. It was going to have a huge impact, whether you were for or against, on our economy and our relations with the rest of the world. And the whole thing was a soap opera. But that, I guess, is the nature of politics in any country and at any point in history. You only have to read a history book or listen to a history podcast. It's always this sort of interplay of big issues, momentous events, kind of big forces in history with individuals and their friendships and their hatreds and their alliances and their, arguments. And that's what makes for the stuff of politics.
So we get 2 hours sleep. With Michael's case, about 8.
And then 4.5.
And then we wake up to the morning headlines.
Let's move on to the day after the night before. Okay, so we are now about to have dawn on the morning after the night before. The country's just made this historic decision. I'd love to plunge right this moment into what's going to unfold next and all the skullduggery. But this is the end of this episode.